Hi, everyone. This is Don Davis. I'm your host of Supply Chain Secrets. Just introducing this week's episode. So this week, we're trying something new, and my guest is Caroline Weaver, and this is actually Caroline's idea, so I want her to get all the credit. But we have this idea of just having this history of shipping series and talking about the past and what kind of things can we learn from the past. I think there's a lot of new people in the industry who just simply don't understand how we got to where we are and how things have evolved. So we introduced this episode and we said, hey, wouldn't it be cool to talk about the first or the last change to the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which actually happened in 1988? Talk a little bit about what the environment was like back then, who were the companies that were around, and what things were different. And there was a conference environment. We dove into that. And then we started to talk a little bit more about the alliances, what alliances existed, who was going at it alone, and then what happened after the legislation was passed. And I think there were some pretty significant impacts. And then we dove into that. And then we talked a little bit more about like the current Ocean Shipping Reform Act and what were some of the motivations there and some thoughts around that. So I thought it was an interesting show. I had a lot of fun doing it. I was thinking about things I haven't thought about in 20, 30 years. So that was really cool. So I hope you like the episode. Give us some feedback. Tell us what you think and enjoy the show.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Don Davis.
Hi, everyone. My name is Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of NVO Experience over here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM. And here is another exciting episode of Supply Chain Secrets. Today, I'm very excited to have Caroline Weaver on the show. Caroline is an account manager here at NYSHEX and actually the brainchild of this show that we're going to produce today. So I'm super excited about it. So Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Very flattered I was invited.
Well, so maybe we could just start off if you could just introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about your background.
Sure. I've been in the shipping industry for about 4 years now. I started off doing operational work at Flexport. I was doing that for about a year, and then I switched into a role digitizing contracts and getting the rates into a platform so we had better cost visibility. And then at the beginning of this year, I took a role as an account manager here at NYSHEX for the NBOCC department. So I've been working a lot with Don and the team building out a good product for the MBOs.
Great. And so let's just talk a little bit about like the story behind this show, because I think it was like a Saturday afternoon and I get a text message from you and you're like, hey, I have this idea. I was watching this YouTube video on Hanjin and maybe it might be interesting to include history as a part of your show and we can partition out some episodes about that. So maybe talk about like your thought process when you were watching this and what motivated you to say, hey, this is something that we should do on Supply Chain Secrets.
I was watching YouTube videos and I got recommended one talking about fall of one of the ocean carriers, and it kind of gave a timeline of it and the historical context around it. I thought that was really interesting, and it's not always easy to find resources like that, but being here, we have so many talented folks that have been in the industry for so long, and the collective knowledge is really powerful, but not everyone is exposed to that. So I think there's a lot of knowledge we can share, and especially talking about what the industry was like and how it's changed. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for the industry to continue to iterate and change and become better. But I think that requires learning a bit about the history of it too.
Yeah, you might have indirectly called me old, which I can wear that. I'm actually 49 years old, for those that didn't know, turned 50 next year. And I started in the industry in December of 1994 with Hapag-Lloyd in the customer service role. So, I mean, I have to wear that. I own it. I've been around a while and I've had tremendous fun in the industry. And I thought, in thinking about what we should do for the show, there's a lot of talk today about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act and what is happening as a result of that, and the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, to be clear. And I thought maybe it made sense to go back in time and talk about the last time we had a change to the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which is actually a change to the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 1984. There was an amendment to it in 1998. And so maybe it makes sense to talk a little bit about what was happening in the industry at that time, because I think it was a very different landscape. and talk about what happened immediately after deregulation happened in 1998. So, Caroline, you got to keep me honest by asking me questions. Otherwise, I'll just drift off the rails and just, I don't know, who knows what I'll do. So you got to keep me in line here.
You got it.
All right. So just to set the scene, and if we go back to 1992 for a second, and believe it or not, I was just starting college at that time, but wasn't working in the industry yet. And there were 30 shipping companies, and these 30 shipping companies represented 63% of the total fleet, which is pretty mind-boggling when you think about it today. You can argue whether there's 9 or 10 major players, but those 9 or 10 major players consume or produce about 90% of the available capacity in the industry. So it's quite a dramatic change that there were a number of shipping companies, but a lot of those have disappeared, and I think there's different reasons for that. One of which being the conferences going away. So there was a conference environment. A conference meant that carriers would come together and set the price for commodities, and they would create these contracts, and they would have a part of this contract. So they would say, like, Caterpillar as an example, and it would list out, like, I don't know, 10, 12 carriers that would participate, but they would agree on the price charged to Caterpillar for, like, earth moving machinery and et cetera. But it was basically a known thing for a certain MQC, and it was public. So all the carriers knew what the rates were, and they agreed to the rates in those contracts.
How is that even allowed? In economics class, you learn about antitrust, collusion, what that looks like. How is that even possible? We're not talking that long ago.
So at this time, I'm just a young Turk, so I can't explain the origin story. I kind of landed in this environment. The way it was explained to me, and by the way, a lot of people said that the shipping industry was like a legal cartel, the word cartel was used a lot. And I'm like, look, all I know is they could do it. Like, how is this allowed? Not really sure. But there was one thing that people would say as a reason why it wasn't like a cartel or this sort of environment with price fixing, is because every member had the right to take an independent action. And an independent action, and there were also non-conference carriers too, by the way, but within the conference, you could say, okay, that's the rate for earth moving machinery. I'm going to take an independent action and say, I'm going to charge a different rate than what everyone else has agreed to. So that ability made it feel like, well, there are options for people, that they don't have to offer the same rate, but the conference agreed on the price setting.
Did they usually go for a lower price if they opted in for IA?
Yeah, the only time you saw lower prices when you did an IA, and really the IAs were driven by these non-conference carriers. So there were some things that were happening where if a non-conference carrier took some rate action, then you might take an IA to protect your market share with that customer. But I will say it was nowhere near the rate wars that we've seen in the future and later in life in the shipping industry. So it was sort of like rate war light, that it wasn't like very aggressive or competitive. I would say the most aggressive trade lane was the U.S. export market to Asia. But you might take IAs. I mean, Hapag-Lloyd wasn't so aggressive in taking IAs at that time. But it was a vehicle to protect your market share.
How often would they meet at these conferences to set the prices? Was it quarterly, annually?
Well, I don't want to act like they were always setting the prices. I think there were certain times contracts would expire, so they'd be talked about at the TACA meetings or the TWRA meetings. It felt like it was monthly. There's a guy I know, Bill Connor. He's still in the industry. He was our TACA rep. Actually, Ken Sine, who's at Wayfair, he is a former TWRA and ANERA conference member. So he knew the carriers, and that's how a lot of carriers knew each other, because they had different people had a seat at the table and had to make pricing decisions for those companies.
So I think we should define the acronyms for all the younger folks that
See,
don't know what you're talking about, don't have a clue, newer to the industry.
Caroline, this is exactly why you're here, because otherwise I'll just keep going and be like, what do you mean you don't know what TWRA is? So there's TACA, which is Transatlantic Conference Agreement. That was the agreement that covered the Europe, in and out of Europe. In Asia, there were two separate conferences, TWRA, which was Trans-Pacific Westbound Rate Agreement, and then ANERA. And I don't know what I know that there's people like Anthony Fulbrook that remember what ANERA stands for, and there's probably people listening to this shouting at their microphone saying like it's Asia, North America. Yeah, I don't remember, but it was basically the import conference.
Okay. So I guess to set the stage, we're talking back before 92, 94, I guess is when the amendment passed for the ocean regulation. But
yeah, it was implemented in 98, and it was the beginning of like alliances. So if we look at it from an alliance standpoint, there were three main alliances. There was the Grand Alliance, which is what Hapag-Lloyd was a part of. And it was NYK, OOCL, and NOL were part of that. And then there was a CKYH, which is weird to say, alliance, which was Costco, K-Line, Yangming, and Hanjin. They put their letter of the carriers in the name, not super creative. And then there was a New World Alliance, which always makes me think of like wrestling. I think there was a New World Order or something. But anyway, it was APL, MOL, and HMM. So those were the alliances.
MOL was in two?
NOL, Neptune Orion Line. That was a Singapore company, Temasek, which actually bought APL and took the APL name. So NOL turned into APL. And then MOL, which was like Mitsui OSK Line, which was a Japanese carrier. By the way, coolest logo. They had an alligator that had like a container on his shoulder, and that was their logo. And I'm like, listen, hands down, best logo. I like the alligator carrying a container. But MOL was the Japanese carrier, and MOL, K-Line, and NYK eventually became OND as those three merged together.
Okay. So we have these alliances. They're going to conferences, not always setting the prices, but maybe talking about strategy, plans for the future. So this Reform Act passes. What changes? Does anything change?
Well, yeah. And before we get there, it's worth noting in this alliance structure, there are three other main players that we didn't talk about, Maersk, MSC, and CMA. And at that time, they were going at it alone. And I think there's some talk and discussion around, is MSC going to go at it alone? And people might think like, wow, what a wild idea. They're going to do their own thing. But frankly, history says that carriers have done this before. It allows them to control their own destiny. You can debate whether or not that's a good idea, but certainly something that has happened historically. And we'll talk a little bit more about the evolution of what happened after deregulation. So you said after the regulation passes, what happens? Well, bad news, the conferences go away, and shippers are allowed to enter into confidential contracts. So no more multiple carrier contracts. It's a contract that you can have with one individual carrier. And the requirement was that they had to be published. And so we have to file them with the FMC. And there were 5 essential terms that you had to publish and make public. And there was origin, destination, duration, MQC, and commodity. And that made the essential terms, that made it a contract. Of course, there's all these other terms, largely rates and lanes and things like that, but that was not public. It was just between you and the carrier.
Okay. So when that happened, I would imagine the prices would go up because you aren't aware of how other people are booking and what their rates are.
Yeah, well, the exact opposite happened, is that the rates went down. And so to put it in perspective, the rate, let's say, New York to Antwerp was $150, $200 plus terminal handling charges. So a local THC fee. So let's call it $300-$400. And that was, it's been different versions of that. The rates obviously went up with COVID and things changed, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it wasn't unusual to have a $200 rate going from New York to Antwerp. When the conferences were around, you started with a base rate of about $3,000. And it wasn't just $3,000. You would always say $3,000 plus, plus, plus. And what does that mean? Well, there were all these surcharges that the carriers would bill separately. So it'd be $3,000. There'd be a currency adjustment factor or a CAF, which you would charge on top, a bunker charge, BAF, and then there would be like terminal handling origin, terminal handling destination. So it was $3,000 plus, plus, plus. And, obviously made it a very compensatory rate at the time. And when you went into these confidential contracts, carriers started to focus more on, well, if I'm going to be competitive, what do I do? How do I differentiate myself? Well, I can do that through price. So they started to reduce the price. And just like I said before, it's like the beginning of this rate war that you just start to have this race to the bottom. And I mean, the shippers certainly benefited, but the carriers became very aggressive.
Okay.
Now, there's one
Kind of surprising.
There's one other thing worth noting, and I didn't mention it before, but and maybe interesting is that there were in prior to these confidential contracts, there were carriers, namely Cast and Canmar, that were Canadian carriers, and they were eventually became part of CP ships. But there were a few carriers, MSC, OO, Hapag-Lloyd, that were active on what was called the cross-border route. And they would go from either Chicago or Detroit to Montreal and out to Europe. And that was not regulated by the conference. And it wasn't under the FMC scope because technically it was exported from Canada. You had to cross the border, so it's unregulated. There were a few things that were unregulated, and that was one of them. And so Cast and Canmar had this ability to charge their own pricing. They could go after this conference business because it was fairly public what the rates were. And they had this wild idea that they were going to just charge a lump sum rate. So they were going to tell the customer, like, none of this plus, plus, plus business. It's just going to be a $3,000 rate out the door. Here you go. And it was tough because as a carrier, they had a competitive advantage because me working for a conference carrier, they wanted to put on all these surcharges, but these Canadian carriers just one low price. And believe it or not, shippers really liked having one low price.
When they published the rates, did it include having to publish surcharges and the price of them?
Yeah, sure. There were surcharges, and they were made public. They were updated. Been a long time, but memory serves, it was quarterly, because the CAF would change. And the CAF, by the way, just to put in perspective, to Europe was typically like 30%. So like North Europe, and then you had like other places where it might be 6 or 9%. Both Asia and Europe had a CAF. And when I started, and I don't remember when the euro exactly started, and I should probably know that, but I do know that all these surcharges or these terminals were in foreign currency. So you had to learn, Belgian francs and Danish kroners and all these other like currencies that, really kind of gone away. But at the time you had to know that these were the prices and they were all in their home currency. So it was for a shipper, like I said, it was a much different environment, but I can imagine that they didn't enjoy having to deal with all these different surcharges.
Yeah, I could see the appeal of having just one sum of it. It's predictable.
It was predictable, probably easier to invoice. I'm sure there were invoice errors, but it was a different world. And I would say that working for a carrier, the productivity totally changed. And I think the volume demands totally changed. And to put it in perspective, I mentioned that I started in 1994. I was hired as a customer service representative, and customer service at that time was probably a cross between inside sales and customer service, because not only did I take bookings, but I also quoted rates. So I did both. And so I dealt with the people that were our pricing people that would, have to make decisions on tell me what the rate is. And they would just look it up in the tariff and tell me what the rate is. And if we could do an IA, or I would basically look it up. Like there's some things I can look up myself, but basically I was doing the pricing and then sending out emails, and it was that bad. It was just me typing it in an email and then sending it to the customer. What what the rate was.
So would that be for FAC contracts more, or freight all kind, or was that for NAC contracts?
I mean, there was really no knack. I mean, you know, you had your conference or your conference contract for like the big shippers, and then there were all these other people that had to move stuff, and you would file it in a tariff. So, and typically what you would do is file a rate in the tariff for 30 days, and basically that's what we're doing is we're quoting rates. We would send it to the customer. Customer would say like, okay, file it. We'd file it in the tariff. Then that rate would be available. And the trick was that rate. So if you were moving hay from LA to Shanghai, once you file a hay rate, that rate becomes available to anybody who's shipping hay in that corridor. So it's not customer specific, it's commodity specific, which is actually incidentally still true today. There still is a tariff, and you could play a fun game and with your friends over the weekend and be like, I'm going to go try and find this rate in somebody's tariff. Not easy to do, but it is by commodity, and there are still rules that say if a carrier files this rate in their public tariff, that it should be accessible to anyone who's shipping that same commodity from a place to a place.
Okay. Do you know when NAC contracts became more of the standard? It's a pretty big deal now. You have certain named accounts, and they try to keep a nice split, they being the carriers or NVOCCs.
Yeah, and I would say that forwarders were probably doing more forwarding services at that time than they were doing like ocean carriers and operating as NVOCC. So, but that came later with confidential contracts. And my sense of what happened is carriers were, so what happened after the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 1998, which is an amendment to 1984. The rates went down. Carriers became more dependent on each other, and the need for these stronger alliances became prevalent because it's a way for you to reduce costs. You couldn't fill up your ship on your own, and then you could offer a variety of services. There was an emphasis on productivity. So I wasn't just like sitting around taking bookings and quoting rates. You know, it was like, okay, you're going to have to do more. You're going to have to take more bookings. And the environment was, I mean, think about this. We had a customer service office in Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, and we had all these like individual booking teams. And then eventually that started to centralize, that you didn't have this local presence anymore. You started to put this into these centers. So there was a regionalization of customer service teams, but it was all cost driven because again, you're under cost pressure. Your margins have started to shrink because of these confidential contracts. And there were a number of things happening both internally on the execution side that there was a way to try and rationalize costs, but then also on the service and network side to say, yeah, we should think about these alliances more broadly because it's a way for us to offer different services at a lower cost without having to buy all those ships.
I think too, the regionalization of the offices probably has something to do with how fast computers advanced and you were able to get internet moving and it was just faster to do business. So once you start getting that data, I don't know, maybe that's too soon, but I feel like that timeline is part of that era.
Yeah, I mean, embarrassingly, when I started, a lot of the rate requests came in by fax. So you would get these curly sheets of paper because they were just like these weird wax paper. So they'd almost look like scrolls, something on like Game of Thrones, like I'd open it from the king or something. But yeah, and sometimes you would fax it back too. That was easy. You would just hand write it on there and send it back to the customer. So now we had a system called Memo, which was our internal communication system, which was like email. And there was a way to start to send emails, which came later. But it took some time for like email to become standard, it's funny having this conversation because I haven't thought about this in a long time. Because we had Memo, and in Memo, there were a lot of people internally that didn't know how to type. So they would you could type in all caps. It wasn't unusual to type in all caps. And we all know like later in life that became like shouting at people.
Now you're screaming.
Yeah, I know. But it became like an adjustment for some people because they were just had like their whole lives didn't like do upper lowercase. Now I always did because I took typing in school. So I was like, oh, look, I can type like a normal person. But it wasn't the norm that people would type in upper and lowercase. So anyway, it was just the sign of the times. It like feels like so long ago. I mean, to also put it in perspective on the inefficiency and where technology was at that point. When I took a booking, I had to go to a clipboard. So there were like 4 of us taking bookings, and there was a clipboard with container numbers on it. And what we would do is like we would take a booking, and then we'd have to ask the customer, all right, do you want the unit grounded or mounted? And I didn't know what that meant. But what they were talking about is that, do you need a chassis? So if it was mounted, it was on wheels. If it was grounded, they were bringing their own wheels. But when we took a booking, we had to go to the clipboard, and then we would write down a booking number and assign it to that container number. So the operations team would then call the depot and say, like, here's the booking. I mean, this is like a real thing. And
I hope your handwriting is good.
well, I mean, think about that. Like, we're doing things like, I mean, today, if you like propose that to somebody, they'd be like, what? Like, can't you just do it on your iPhone or something? But it's really how things were. And that was the speed that we moved. So to your point, I mean, I think email and technology changed things. Hapag actually had moved to a new system called FIS, which stood for Freight Information Systems. They're on their 3rd version of this product, but that product, I think, for Hapag-Lloyd anyway, created a ton of efficiency because it was a system designed that everyone would use it. And before that, everyone had operations had this Nemo system, and our booking system was called CICS. And so there were all these things that were just different systems. They didn't talk to each other. You'd have to input it into the system. And when Hapag went to FIS, it really changed the company because it created all this efficiency. So to your point, like, technology definitely played a role, which was really important because, again, the revenues are going down at that time.
Right. Frankly, I think we should have a separate episode just on how the industry has evolved with the technology. I recently learned how a telex machine worked, and I think that'd be fun to share. We'll leave a little cliffhanger for the listeners.
That's right. I mean, it's actually, like I said, this is a fun conversation to have, and I appreciate so much that you had the idea to have this episode because we're talking about things I haven't thought about in a long time, but it's a reminder of like how far we've come as an industry that, I mean, it really wasn't that long ago, right? That, we're talking like the late 90s. I mean, great era of music, by the way, but also like a great era for like a technology boom. And it's funny because it came at the right time because with this deregulation, there was really a need for carriers to start to be more cost focused given that their margins were changing. But I mean, okay, so I've talked a lot. I mean, I talked a lot about like, this is what happened before, this is what happened after. And I think the one takeaway you could say is that the Shipping Act of 1998, let's just call it, it's easier to say, that it had a major impact on the industry and really changed the industry. And the effect was that, revenues went down, carriers became more cost conscious, and that you saw this increased dependence on alliances. And there was, alliances had kind of changed, that there was all this moving of partners. And it was tough because I think many carriers were in different places in terms of the health of their balance sheet. And you saw some companies go bankrupt. There's a company called Choyang, Choyang. They went bankrupt, had a significant impact on the industry that their containers were like arrested in the port. And it just was a big, you couldn't get to them. And, you might've had them on your ship and you had to do something about it. So as a carrier, but there were all these things that had happened. But I think the interesting point is like, 63% of the market or 63% of the fleet was from 30 carriers. I mean, today it's a totally different story because many of those were absorbed. And I think the next phase was alliance dependency and consolidation that you started to see these reactions from carriers. And I think the thing that drove Hapag-Lloyd was there was a company called P&O and there was a company called Ned-Lloyd, and P&O bought Ned-Lloyd and became P&O Ned-Lloyd. And Hapag had some partnerships with them, and then Maersk bought P&O Ned Lloyd shortly after they bought Sealand, and I think Maersk was the first on this consolidation bit. And then when they bought P&O, the reaction from Hapag-Lloyd is they bought this company called CP Ships, and CP Ships was, this is a good trivia question, probably 12 carriers underneath CP Ships. So there was like Italia Line, Conship, Likes, Cast, Canmar. There were just all these different, Ansdell, all these different companies that were part of CP Ships that they acquired. And but anyway, not to like list out all these companies that aren't around anymore.
Name dropping.
There was just this period of consolidation which happened, which again was driven by the type of balance sheets and what was happening with the carriers.
Okay. So what do you think led to the passage of the new Ocean Reform Act?
Oh, the 2022 one.
Right, the current one.
Well, I mean, I think unfortunately it's driven a lot by political pressure. And I think there's a number of exporters who were unhappy with how they're being treated because they had their bookings being canceled and they couldn't move cargo to Asia. And everybody knew that the carriers were moving empties back to Asia because the rates were so high. And from a financial result perspective, it makes sense, right? Because if I can improve my container velocity by sending it back empty and someone can just pick it up and use it, that's probably better than giving it to somebody who's going to hang on to it. And then who knows when they're going to give it back to me? Maybe they need free time or et cetera, but it's just going to slow down that container velocity. And me as a carrier, I'm going to have to either try and on-hire equipment or somehow get containers because I want to maximize the ship. Rates are really high, so that's top of mind for me. Now, that doesn't mean that carriers didn't export at all. It just means that they had a preference towards the imports and maybe people didn't get their stuff moved. And I think that caused a lot of frustration that there was enough of that. And Congress was lobbied significantly by a variety of companies representing these exporters. And as a result, there was a ton of political pressure. And I think the optics on the carriers wasn't great. Anytime you have a low on-time performance and you have people who are upset and you're making billions of dollars, like people, it looks bad and it feels like something has to be done about it. And I think that drove a lot of the behavior. Now, I think that carriers also get blamed for inflation because the rates were so high. I don't think that's really fair. And I think Lars Jensen also has his opinion that if you look at the cost per unit, it's sort of nebulous. So it doesn't lead to the same amount of cost increases that you've seen through inflation. But I think there was just a ton of political pressure on the industry, and it felt like there was a need for change. Therefore, the FMC has now broader powers to help shippers and investigate these complaints, because prior to this, they didn't really have the ability to do anything about these sort of behaviors that our carriers are being accused of. The FMC was there to make sure they were compliant and following the rules. But as far as like investigating some of these accusations, it had to be litigated. It wasn't the FMC's role, and that changed with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 22. So, I mean, I think there's a lot that still remains to be seen with Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. I think that a lot of the law is still being written, but certainly I would say change is in order and will continue to change as we find out more about how this law is going to be implemented.
I'd be interested to learn more about if the new Ocean Shipping Reform Act passed so quickly. It was proposed and passed very fast for something going through Congress. I wonder if that was maybe in part due to the internet and being able to see people tweet about things. Like the pandemic definitely exacerbated, people wanting to get their items that they're ordering faster. They're not getting it. So it's something that everyone had visibility into. And maybe that was a quicker win for Congress because it was a bipartisan pass.
It is, and that I think is why it's hailed as a miracle because I think we both know that it doesn't feel like our government agrees on very many things, but this was one where both sides of the aisle came together and passed something pretty quickly So, I mean, despite the reasons behind it, I think that there's still a lot that remains to be seen as far as the benefits and who wins. But it feels like this bill is geared a lot more towards shippers. And, the thing that concerns me is like these unintended effects of the bill. That the intent is, I want to make sure that exporters are being able to ship their stuff abroad. That makes total sense. What could be an unintended impact? Well, I don't know. There's a lot of pressure on alliances, and if alliances should even be allowed. I think there's this continuation of this antitrust immunity for carriers being voted on in Brussels. That'll effectively allow them to continue in the alliance, and I think that's happening in April. And there's some debate over whether or not that should be allowed. And I would say, it would really be devastating if you can't have carrier alliances, because then if every carrier has to go at it on its own, what do those services look like? Where are they going to deploy their capacity? Is everyone going to survive that? It would just really have a potentially negative effect, I think, on the industry.
Yeah, you end up actually lowering the amount of competition by doing that.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah, and services I don't think will be better, but that's, let's hope it doesn't come to that, and, smarter minds prevail, and we end up with a positive outcome. So, all right, is there anything that you want to ask me? Because now I'm at a point in the show where I want to ask you a question. I mean, typically, I'm the one who's asking people questions, but now I've been peppered with questions for 30 minutes. So I want to turn the table. I just want to make sure, is there anything else you want to ask me about what we've covered so far?
I think we covered a great deal.
I think so too. I think it was a lot of fun for me. But so from your perspective, I mean, you've been in the industry, you said 4 years. You've made some observations. You're now at a startup who are trying to solve problems for the industry. What stands out to you? Because I think there are a lot of people who come into this industry and they're surprised by a number of things, a lot of things they might not have known until they get involved. And what stands out to you when you think about that question of what surprises you the most about the shipping industry when you think about your journey so far in this space?
Really, it's just the fact that most of these companies have been around for so long, 100+ years for some of these ocean carriers. And I've entered the industry in 2019, more or less. So seeing the tech now and how we do processes and how it all works, I still think there's way more we could do to improve the efficiency of things, and just being able to bring the industry to a better spot, more tech friendly. Think about Amazon and how they changed the e-commerce space. They set a new standard. We haven't really had too much of that yet. I think we're in a time now where there's a lot of focus at all the different players. So ocean carriers, shippers, NVOs, they're all focusing on how do we utilize tech and data specifically to get to a place where we're making smarter decisions, faster, more efficient. So just hearing you talk about how in the late 90s you're still sending faxes, you're still doing all these things by hand, and whatever data you have is just, it could be a 0, it could be an O, you have no idea. But it's interesting hearing that it really hasn't been that long, but just in my time and being in the industry, things feel like they move really quickly. But I've also only been at these tech companies that are really working to change the space. But I'm curious to see how quickly the industry evolves over the coming, say, next decade or so.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I mean, I think technology hasn't really been part of the shipping industry. You might say that's an oxymoron to put shipping industry and technology together, because they've just been it's been the Stone Age. I mean, I've heard more than one person refer to the shipping industry as the Stone Age. But I think, to be fair, my sense is that for a long time, the shipping industry has been a low margin industry. And when you have low yields, you're doing handstands to try and keep your company solvent. You may not be thinking about investing in technology. You're going to lead with trying to reduce my cost. And if you can't really demonstrate that there's a huge efficiency gain or that you're saving money, then I think you have a harder time trying to convince someone to invest in technology. And that's why I say, the carriers, took a lot of grief over their results. over the past 2 years, because there are those who kind of pointed at the carriers and said, that's too much money. But in my view, I think it creates an opportunity for them to invest in things that can help the industry, because as a person who worked at a carrier and knowing a lot of people at carriers, they want to do the right things. They want to help companies move their stuff. They're not these sinister, evil people that want to make life difficult. But there's a lot of things that happened over the past 2 years that weren't in their control, whether that's congestion at the port or COVID outbreaks or ever getting stuck. And so there's just all these shocks to the supply chain, and it made it very difficult for them to do what they wanted to do. Now that we're in a more normal period where things are more stable, my hope is that we'll start to look for solutions that'll help both parties and just make the industry better, because there's such an opportunity there. And it seems like it's on its way, but to your point, I think over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot of things happen. And my guess is things are going to start to improve even faster than they did in the previous 30.
Yeah.
Well,
awesome.
Well, Caroline, I've had a lot of fun, taking a stroll down memory lane here with you. So this is our first foray into the history of shipping series. So we could plan on continuing to do this. So for those listeners out there, don't forget, rate us, review us, give us feedback. Tell me what you think. You love the history episode. You want us to dive in on something else. Be happy to do it. But thanks for listening, everybody. And I hope you like the show. Thanks for coming on, Caroline.
Thanks, Don.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.